This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for ISMs. Now, ISMs is a podcast about all those positive words that end in ISM. Because there's plenty of negative words, but we're going to try to stay away from them. Um, and my guest today is Keith Allison, and Keith was referred to me from some wonderful people in the music industry here in Northeast Ohio. So I'm assuming, Keith, you are musical in some way.
I wish I had musical ability. I have the ability to enjoy it. I am a poet, so I've worked with a lot of musicians, mixing music and poetry and things like that. But my skills do not go over into any musical ability, unfortunately.
Well, even the poetry, though, is musical. And I think that's important for many of us to understand. I know when I was in school and you had to learn poetry, uh, my father was totally excited because he loved to write poetry. And I would come home and I'd say, I don't understand. What are these beats? What are these sounds? Why am I supposed to understand these words? And his comment to me was, if you don't get it, move on to something else because
Mm.
eventually you're going to get it. He said, but you're trying too hard. And next thing I
Not
knew,
necessarily
uh,
move away from it, but move away from focusing on trying to figure it out and just let it come to you.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
I like that.
So I understand that we're all going through challenging times right now. There's always going to be a so called winner and a so called loser. And if we look at the football game yesterday with the Cleveland Browns were losers one more time. Um, and yet we still seem to, at least in the Cleveland area, we still seem to come back and say, that's okay. There's always tomorrow.
Mm.
But something happened this past year, and there's so many people who have said, you know what? I don't like the way the election turned out, so I'm just going to hide under the blankets for the next 4 years. But you really can't do that. It's
Mhm.
just not possible. So I'm asking individuals like yourself, how are you getting through it? And how are you helping those of us who may be questioning, you know, is it okay to be sad or is it
Yeah.
okay to be happy? So take it away, Keith.
Big topic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always okay to be sad. It's always okay to be happy. It's always okay to find, both the good and the bad in life. If we want change, we've got to acknowledge, the atrocities, the horrors, the dangers, the inequalities, and you got to have a conversation. You got to push for better. So there has to be still some awareness of that, but also to be an advocate also means taking care of yourself. And if you never find happy moments, you're going to really struggle to have self-care, as well as enjoyment and, and the beauty that is still in life and the wonderful humans out there who, are putting music into the world or putting poetry into the world or, um, just hope and love and community into the world. So I think all of the feelings are valid. I think whatever you're feeling is valid, and for most of us, it ranges. For most of us, we're going to feel the sadness some of the time. We're going to feel the anger some of the time. We're going to feel the happiness some of the time. Um, and yeah, it's okay for all of those feelings to come about, but to be a to be someone helping to make the world a better place, you've got to acknowledge the lows, but you still have to enjoy the highs too. You still have to enjoy the parts of life that are still, out there, and the love and the community and the friendships and the art and all of those things that are still, still amazing. There's still so many beautiful things in the world to enjoy, as we push for change in the places that are less, amazing.
It's interesting because we also do a podcast on here called Grief Belief.
Mm.
And the question always comes up when people are grieving. And there are many people who are grieving now. It's not a death, it's just, hey, this isn't what I was expecting. But they say, why is it I can laugh 1 minute and feel really, really good? And then the next minute, it hits me like a ton of bricks.
Mhm.
And that's what grief is about,
Yeah.
but it's about maneuvering through it. So when you're writing poetry, I'm assuming there are some times that you're really at a low, and that's how
Hmm.
your poetry comes out. And there are other times that you're at a high, and there's all that positive ism words going through. What got you into poetry? What made you decide that this is the way that you want to express yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, poetry goes back to some extent to high school when you had to learn it and you had to write it, and a few moments in there where I wrote something required, and I was like actually kind of like what I did, and I didn't know that that would be any further into my life, but it still was a nice recognition of like, okay, sometimes this can actually be kind of cool and kind of fun. And I wish we taught more of the fun coolness than what we sometimes do, as we learn poetry in the school age years. But yeah, then I continued on. I did poetry here and there, like something would come to mind. And I think what really changed, I was very outspoken on social media um, for long and for a long time. I went vegan in 2011, and what we do in our food system, whether you're vegan or not, is pretty atrocious when you look at the realities of our system. And again, accepting and adjusting to those realities and speaking about and dealing with them honestly. And I was very outspoken on social media about my thoughts and what the system looked like. And you get replies, and I started writing what became longer, like essays, but like you just like you keep getting pushed and keep it in challenge, which keeps getting your brain moving and keeping to think about things. And then what happened is I had some friends who started an open mic in the Akron area, and they had a poetry, monthly poetry event, and I started showing up, and I'd written a few pieces here and there, but then as you're sitting and you're around other people who are using words this way, you're like, ooh, I want to do that. I can listen to music and go like, oh, I want to do that, but I don't have pitch, I don't have tone, I don't have, I don't have the things I need to make it like, oh, somebody would want to hear me perform. But I do have a voice that I can use in poetry, and so that just kind of inspired. So a lot of the things then I started replying in like poetry started coming out instead of more like essay form. A lot of my poetry does speak to, the inner atrocities, to humans, to the fellow animals we share the world with. And it's kind of like my, instead of like screaming out the door, instead of falling into the sadness, I have this area that I can vent, this area that I can show the preposterousness of some things, that I can highlight the inequalities that are happening in our system. So, and there's a release to that. There's a huge release to me that allows me to express those things and still then move forward and enjoy other parts of the day, as wrong as some of these things are, to still be able to speak out for those, but also to still be able to enjoy my kids, enjoy life, enjoy friends, enjoy community. um, so I do write some out of happiness, but a lot of my poetry ends up being more of and it's sometimes sarcastic, it's sometimes comical, but a lot of it is still like a response to a world that has some serious room for growth.
And it's interesting because as I said earlier, my father wrote a lot of poetry, and my grandfather did, and then my brother started to. And again, when I got in high school and I had to write something, I just struggled. And my father used to say, "You don't have to rhyme spoon and moon." And it was like, but I don't know any other way of doing it. Um, but surprisingly, when my father passed away, my mother asked my brothers and I if we wanted to speak. And I wrote a eulogy. And
Mm,
it wasn't in poetry necessarily, but as I look back at it, there is a little bit of
yeah.
poetry in it. And I realized at that time that he left me something. The
Mm,
words that I never thought I had before,
yeah.
now I can start to put out, because I wasn't thinking about rhyming or anything else, or what is the meter of it. It was like, I'm just going to put these words out there and I'm going to say what I want to say. And so poetry in some ways is almost like journaling for you too, because you're getting
Mhm.
out your thoughts.
Yeah.
um, and that's something that we question people about their thoughts. We are so judgmental. I
Hmm.
mean, somebody might come up to you and say, "Really, Keith? Vegan? Why? Don't you like a good steak Or
Right.
don't, you know what? The why is because this is what I chose.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with whether you think it's right or wrong. It's what I chose. The
Mm,
same way as religion, as is politics. We
right.
get to choose because we're human.
Right. And the other person deciding whether it's right or wrong is not necessarily relevant to what you feel is the right or wrong
Ex-
option
e-
there. Yeah.
Exactly. So, what is it like for you on a typical day if you're going to write something? Do you just sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and just say, okay, I'm going to write about the clouds in the sky?
Yeah.
How does it happen?
A lot of mine comes like I said, in response. So it might be a new news story, or it might be something somebody says to me in person, or to me on Facebook, or someone says to somebody else on Facebook, and you just kind of like plays in your head where it doesn't just like some things you just read and you move right on, and other things like that's a ridiculous comment, or that comment doesn't see the full picture or whatever, and it plays in your head. Most of my writing happens. Um, when I'm kind of off on my own, like I'll go for a walk or ride in my car by myself or something, and then you're just kind of sitting in your head some of the time. And sometimes I'm listening to music and my mind's all focused on that, but other times I'm just letting my mind think. And especially if I have like a start of something, an idea of something, I will say, and for anyone listening, um, one of the ways, like, I don't normally have like, oh, I'm going to sit down on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. and write. I don't have like a set. There are times where I'll go a whole month without writing anything, and times where I'll write, several pieces in a day or something. Um, but like if I ever do feel like, oh, I haven't been a long time since I'm writing, there are pieces that, as you mentioned, the differences in poetry, there are pieces that just make it easier to write for me, and pieces that are hard, that aren't the things you normally associate with poetry, like an erasure poem or a blackout poem, where you take something and you kind of get rid of and leave what you want it to say. It's something like I don't have to feel like, oh, I'm in an artistic mood to like, all right, let me scribble some words out here. But even somebody who doesn't consider themselves a poet can sit there and do that and come up with something really cool at the other end. Or sometimes like a haiku is a nice built-in structure. Contrapuntal is a really cool poetry form that works in my head more like a puzzle. There's certainly creativity going into it, but it works in a different way. Like, so some of the different forms of poetry will pull you in a different way that might make you think about writing in a time where you weren't necessarily feeling like, oh, I'm feeling like writing today. So there are some little ways I can move even if I don't feel especially expressive in that day.
So, did poetry lead you into a career path, or is poetry something that's personal? It's something you just do when you want to do it.
Yeah, poetry is more personal. I mean, I've made money off performing on poetry, and I host an event, and so there are certainly some exchanges of money going on in the poetry world. It's hard, certainly, to make a living in the poetry world. Even you look around at some of the best poets out there working today, and most of them have other jobs creating money, um, so that they can do this thing they love.
Right.
So it didn't lead me to work. I've used poetry in my jobs, but not like it's the main thing I'm doing. So yeah, mostly poetry is an enjoyment for me, as a way to build community, a way to express, both with my own poetry, but also bringing in other artists to perform, and gathering folks together, and that sort of thing as well.
So, when many of us think of poetry readings, and
Yeah,
it's obviously going to age me right now,
you're
but
good.
I think about the late 50s and 60s, the beatnik era,
Mhm.
and we still see it in movies where they're in this very dark coffee house and they rattle off words, and a lot of times that poetry just doesn't resonate with me at all. But that's what I remember growing up. In fact, I think my first date I ever had took me to a poetry reading, and I was like terrified. It was like everybody just looked so different from me. And I
Mm.
remember coming home and saying to my father, that's not the kind of poetry you write. And he goes, no, but you learned something new today, didn't you? And it was like, oh, I guess I did. I never went back to it. But what is poetry reading like today? Is it
Yeah.
still like those smoke and mirrors of the past?
probably less like that, but there's certainly a lot of variations. I mean, I love that your dad kept dropping little bits of wisdom to you here and there as you express your day and things, and how to just kind of give you that little bit of extra thing to think about. He sounds very skilled in that, which is great. There's certainly poetry readings where a poet is reading straight out of a book, but there's a lot of performance poetry going on. Um, and both can be really enjoyable. I don't want to knock either one, but there are poetry slams where there's actual competition and there's money on the line and things like that, and that brings in a lot of folks. That can builds up an excitement level. You mentioned sports earlier. We like the competitive nature in America of like something's on the line and somebody's going to win and somebody's going to take home more money. So slams usually seem to do the best in the poetry world as far as bringing people in. I love it. I do a monthly event at the Rialto Theater, the first Wednesday of every month in Akron, and I bring in a different feature every month. I don't know, we're in the middle of our third year, so that's a lot of different features, one a month, that have come. And one of the cool things, you get to sit with a poet, two sets. There's an open mic as well, but you really get a feel for one poet versus a lot of places you get like a piece here, this one, which is cool too. But I love just really diving into a singular poet, and then an open mic for any of their voices in the room, and then closing the night back out with that same poet. I would say a lot of the features I bring in are more spoken word poets, but not all of them, where they're projecting, they're memorized, at least some of the pieces and things like that. And it is like a very much like a grabbing performance. It'd be a little different than the little beatnik poetry event you were talking about. But I've seen plenty of people just hold their book up and read out their poem and be like absolutely stunning. So I think there's still a huge variation, like there is in music. There's a huge variation of what a song is. What type of music, what genre are you listening to? There's a lot of variation in poetry too, but a lot of it, a lot of contemporary poetry is very like feeling based and very expressive, and I wish more people had that view like you did, or had the view like a lot of us did in freshman year high school, that poetry is so much more than that. It can be that too, but it's so much more than that. And I would love to see even more interest and excitement in the poetry world.
Well, and it's nice to know that there are places like the Rialto that are bringing this to life, and especially in an area that we may not have thought of. Hey, Kenmore is where people are going to go to listen to poetry. Although, who would have thought Kenmore would become as beautiful as it has become in the last couple of years?
Right.
And Jim Ballard and I talked about this when he was on as well, that one of the positive things that you and he and other people in this area are doing is that you're giving all of us, no matter what our background is, something new, something different in entertainment. You're giving us an opportunity to see the good and see differences. I mean, walking down the street, I wouldn't know that you're a poet or not. Okay. But now I walk into this, audience to see what is poetry all about. Is it, as black and white as I thought it was growing up, or is it something different? And that's the same thing that we find in music, in all forms of art, that we have to start opening up our minds. Because if we can do it in the cultural things, I think our humanity is going to start to change in a more positive manner. As I said a number of times on this show, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, I saw this big, beautiful, wonderful world ahead of us. And it still is. But sometimes we just have to rein it back in and, accept the fact that we may not be best friends with our neighbors, but we can be friendly to our neighbors. And that is important. So, how does poetry help you during these challenging times? Because I'm sure you are amongst people too that on the other side of the fence, sitting on the fence, and even further away than you are on the fence.
Poetry poetry is a really good way for me to dive into my own thoughts and just think through things, but also a way that I can find a way to express things in a way that might help people to see things in a different light. I know we're very divided in this country, and sometimes even hard to have the conversations of where all this overlap is, because there is a lot of overlap in humanity. And I think some of the pieces that we need more of is the understanding and the empathy of um, those who are impacted by policies that many of us are scared are getting worse here right now. And I think, yeah, poetry does that. I think music does that. I think reading does that. It opens you up to other people and to thinking and feeling and other ideas and other concepts in a way that usually involves growth for all of us, and having those conversations and having those ideas. So I think there's a lot of value for all of us in that. But personally, poetry allows me to release. It allows me to put in my own thoughts. It allows me to express things in a way that gets a room to think, whether you agree or not. And the poetry world has similar politics. Most of the people to those that I share myself, usually, not always, but most of the, it's going to go. But also, like, it's a very open world to expression, and you can have a different thought, and if you express it like with poetry, you give it a story, you give it art in a way that just having a conversation doesn't. So if I go up to somebody and say like, I don't do this and do this and this, like, that's a different thing than if they're listening to art, whether it's poetry or other forms. And it's a way that can get people to really start listening in a way they would have blocked out if it came out as a conversation. So I think poetry opens up those doors to have, and music as well, to have those conversations, to have people listening in a way that might hook them in, and get them to reevaluate, get me to reevaluate things too as we go through what things am I not fully considering as well.
And there's so many different forms of poetry that most of us probably don't even realize. Um, my one brother does free form,
Mm-hmm.
and every year, his New Year's message, he goes through everything that has happened over the year in free form, and it goes on and on and on and on. Sometimes it takes me 2 or 3 days to actually read through it, but it's amazing how much I have forgotten that has happened. And it's more interesting to read it that way than for me to go online and remember, who did what and when.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you were taught poetry growing up, but almost everything I remember in high school had an actual rhyme. And
Mm,
that's where, you know, I had that roadblock with it, and why my father said,
yeah.
Bean and Spoon don't have to rhyme, but it was like, but what other kind of poetry is there? So can you give us some ideas on, you know, what it would look like?
Yeah. And so certainly there are options, even in rhyming, there's variations of, is it an A-B rhyme, or is it, ABC, and then you rhyme again later. And so there's even variations in that. I used to do more rhyming poetry. I still do a little bit. Um, Most of my rhyming poetry now, though, is when you're like talking about something darker, and rhyming can kind of like give you this stark contrast between these dark concepts. And you expect in rhyming poetry, you expect something like childish almost, or happy often. And so sometimes that's my playful area in there. I'll take a subject, but talk about it in rhyming. I mentioned contrapuntals before, so I can walk through those for anyone
Sure, I'm
who's
not even sure what that is.
so a contrapuntal is a really fun one. Patrick Roche, who's an amazing poet, is the one who turned me on to these. But a contrapuntal is written in two columns, and the first column, you read down. The first column is one poem. The second column is its own second poem, and then you read across, combining the two columns to make a third piece. And it takes some design efforts
Sure.
to, but in a way that doesn't normally feel like what poets like. You cannot be a poet and you can like, oh, I want to combine words in a way that changes them when you read straight down or when you read across. There are poems that you read like first line to end line, and then you read backwards, like end line back to first line. I should know what that's called, but I don't. But I've seen some really cool ones like that. Haikus are nice little fun, very abbreviated space, and I've seen some cool events with like haiku slam type idea where
Yep.
you get a winner at the end, but you have a few syllables to work with each time, and you got to put as much as you can in these 17 syllables. And so yeah, I do a free verse is very popular now. I like that a lot, just kind of writing things as they come to me, and I'll tweak it and I'll edit some things too, but not feeling necessarily like you have to fit in a said form.
Right.
So yeah, lots of variation to pull in a lot of different folks of what's speaking to you, and the same person can run through all of those, or you can have one that's where you sit. You're like, I only write similes, or I only write wasn't even the word I was looking for, but I only write haikus or whatever, that
Right.
where you sit in one thing. But for most of us, there's definitely some variation in what forms you play with and try, and you can still learn new ones all the time. There's plenty of forms I don't even know of poetry. Like I'll see things online for a class, and I was like, oh wait, what is that?
So how can our listeners find your poetry? I know they can come out to Kenmore the first Wednesday of every month.
Love to have.
And that is by reservation, or can they
Oh,
just
it's open. It's
okay.
it's open, and it's there's a suggested $5 donation that goes straight to the feature, but there is no actual cover charge. So even if you're not able to afford the $5 donation, we'd still love to have you. So yeah, just come on out any first Wednesday of the month. The next one's on New Year's Day. And Jim Ballard, who you mentioned, we're going to have our first musical guest, as well as our featured poet is Kurt Witt. But we thought with it actually landing on a holiday, we'd add a little bit extra to it. So Jim's
Sure.
going to play some music that night for us too. But to find my work, I perform a lot under Angry Cow Poetry. So I do have a website, angrycowpoetry.com. Pretty easy to remember, but I'm also on Instagram or Facebook, or occasionally on TikTok under Angry Cow Poetry. So yeah, lots of ways to connect.
That's wonderful. Now, TikTok, I'm glad you brought it up. You may not have it
Yeah.
in the future. So your stuff is still available, but it won't be available as video then. Is that correct? Would you think
Uh,
of taking that to YouTube instead?
Yeah, all my stuff that's elsewhere is on YouTube as
Okay.
well. The easiest way to find like it really nicely organized and everything is my website, angrycowpoetry.com. But you can scroll through Instagram and see videos. And Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, you can upload them separate.
Right.
But for my website, I'll link you to YouTube. But you can also find Angry Cow Poetry on YouTube as well. Now that you mentioned that, yes.
That is wonderful. I want to thank you because this conversation, we may not have told people, hey, this is what you should do to get over your anger or to get through the next 4 years. What we're telling you is there are options. There are ways of getting together with like-minded people and even meeting some people who are on the opposite side of the fence and maybe come to some agreements. And I know for me, I'm tired of feeling angry.
Mm-hmm.
I went through the anger after the 2016 election. And the reason I went through anger, and I hope people will understand this, my mother was 96 and a half years old. My mother wanted Hillary to win. My mother wanted to see a woman
Yeah,
become president. And my
sure.
mother basically had been a Democrat most of her life.
Yeah.
And my mother was on her deathbed, but she didn't know it. And she would say to my brother and I, I'm so glad I voted. You know, my candidate's going to win. You've got to promise me nothing else will happen. My mother passed away a month before the election.
Mm.
And when the election was called, I called my brother in New York and said, we let her down.
Mm.
And I allowed those 4 years to feel guilty.
Mm.
I've decided that I don't want to feel that way anymore.
Yeah.
I got to do what is best for me and what is best for those around me. And that is to offer positivity. And you certainly did that today. And I want to thank you for that. And January 1st, to have an event to go to, I
Yeah.
mean, come on, if you're in Northeast Ohio, Kenmore is the place to go.
Kenmore's been great. I'm really enjoying what's been going on in Kenmore the last several years. So if you're not yet familiar with the newer workings of Kenmore, the Rialto Theater, and so many other things, yeah, come on out.
I appreciate it. Well, you have a happy holiday and
Thank you.
thanks for being on ISMs. Have
Thank
a
you, Ken.
great day.
You
Bye bye
too.
now.
Bye.